If you live in a Canadian city, you've walked over a Canada Iron Foundries casting today. 3 letters, CIF, stamped into a manhole cover, a hydrant, a storm drain you didn't look at twice. At its peak, the company ran 5 blast furnaces and foundries across 7 towns and 2 provinces, pouring the cast iron that became the underground skeleton of every major Canadian city. It survived the bankruptcy of its own parent corporation in 1913. Survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars. Survived plastic pipe and recession. Survived the rise of American competitors. And then, after more than 100 years of pouring iron in Trois-Rivières, the foundry on Boulevard du Saint-Maurice went silent for the last time. How does a company that built the underground bones of every Canadian city simply disappear? What happened? Chapter 1. The letters. Under your feet. The story leads back to a wedge of land where 2 rivers meet in Quebec, where the Saint-Maurice runs down out of the boreal interior and pours its tea-brown water into the broad gray channel of the St. Lawrence. The city of Trois-Rivières grew up over 3.5 centuries on the strength of one resource: iron. Bog iron from the Mauricie swamps, charcoal from the forests, water power from the rapids. The city today has just under 140,000 people and a modest cluster of pulp and paper mills along the riverfront, diminished but not abandoned. Walk east along Boulevard du Saint-Maurice toward the Pont du Plessis, however, and you'll come to a parcel of land that was, for almost a century, the operating center of an empire most Canadians never knew existed. In 1908, the year the Great Downtown Fire burned 800 buildings to the ground, an industrial reconstruction began on that parcel that would link a single Mauricie iron pour to the streets, sewers, and water mains of every major Canadian city. The company that did it was called Canada Iron Foundries Limited. After 1970, it called itself Canron. Today both names are gone, folded into other companies, sold off in pieces, dismantled without ceremony, and only the 3-letter mark remains, stamped on hydrants and storm drains and manhole covers that Canadians walk over every day without seeing. That mark belonged to a man. His name was George Edward Drummond. Born in 1857 to an Irish emigrant family in Montreal. Brother to the poet whose habitant verses Canadian schoolchildren memorized for a century. A blast furnace builder who, by the age of 35, had pulled together the largest charcoal ironworks in North America on a riverbank 10 kilometers north of where his namesake foundry would eventually stand. He built something national. He went broke once and rebuilt it. And the iron he poured, pig iron, pipe iron, manhole cover iron, became the literal skeleton of Canadian cities still drawing water through it 100 years later. This is his story, and the story of what came after him, and of how a company that built the bones of a country was sold off so quietly, in transactions so dry and so far from any factory gate, that no one made a speech. No one took a final photograph. The foundry simply stopped pouring one day, and a few months later the gate was padlocked, and the work moved south, or moved into plastic, or moved nowhere at all. But the letters stayed under our feet. Chapter 2. The Drummond Brothers. To understand the CIF mark, you have to understand a family. The Drummonds, Drum, originally, came to Montreal from the north of Ireland in the 1860s. The father, George Drum, had served in the Royal Irish Constabulary. He had quarreled with Lord Leitrim over the landlord system, suffered a paralytic stroke, and brought his 4 sons across the Atlantic in search of a quieter life. The quieter life did not arrive. What arrived instead was the rougher, faster, more democratic prosperity of mid-Victorian Canada. And the 4 sons threw themselves into it with the energy of men who had nothing to lose. One of them, William Henry, became a doctor, and then, more famously, a poet. He wrote in habitant dialect about Quebec voyageurs and farmers. The Wreck of the Julie plant sold tens of thousands of copies. He gave readings on both sides of the Atlantic and counted Rudyard Kipling among his admirers. He died in 1907 at Cobalt, Ontario, where he had gone to inspect a mining property, and is now, by some measure of irony, better remembered in Canadian literary anthologies than the three brothers who built the family's actual fortune. Those brothers were John James, Thomas Joseph, and George Edward. They went into iron. In 1883, George Edward Drummond, 26 years old, just back from a tour of American ironworks in Pennsylvania and Ohio, partnered with a Montreal industrialist named John McDougall to incorporate the Canada Iron Furnace Company. The plan was straightforward and audacious. The Forges du Saint-Maurice, the first ironworks in New France, established by royal patent in 1730 and operated continuously for 153 years under French, then British, then Canadian ownership, had finally closed that same year. Its workers, its skills, its bog iron knowledge, all of it was suddenly available. And in the village of Saint-Maurice, 10 kilometers from Trois-Rivières, an older charcoal forge had been running since 1854 on the strength of the same Mauricie ore deposits. The forge was called Radnor. The Hall estate of Quebec City owned it. McDougall and the Drummonds bought it. Then George Edward built something on top of it that had never existed in Canada before. He raised a charcoal blast furnace 40 feet tall with a 9-foot opening at the throat. His own biographer in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography would later describe it as the largest of its kind in North America. It consumed Mauricie ore and Mauricie charcoal in quantities that put 850 men to work at peak, 700 of them farmers from the surrounding parishes who raked iron out of the bogs in summer, cut wood in autumn, and burned it into charcoal through the winter. By 1893, the furnace was producing more than 7,400 tons of charcoal cast iron a year. Federal bounty payments under the National Policy Tariff flowed back to it in 5-figure sums. The Mauricie was working again. The forges were lit. And George Edward Drummond, just past his 35th birthday, sat at the center of an iron operation the country had never quite seen before. His brother, John James, went west to run a coke furnace operation at Midland, Ontario. 350 men, the largest payroll in Simcoe County. His brother Thomas Joseph ran the Montreal end of the business. The McDougall side was buying up Iron Foundries, St. Thomas, Ontario, in 1903, which gave the family its second main casting plant. Radnor itself, by then, was a small kingdom. The blast furnace stack rose above the trees on the Rivière au Large. Long sheds of corrugated iron extended down the slope toward the river. The casting house was open at one end, so the molten iron could be poured into sand molds laid out in long rows on the floor. 850 men in summer, fewer in winter, working in heat that could blister paint, and breathing smoke that hung in the spruce trees for miles. The Mauricie families who had given their men to the Forges du Saint-Maurice for 150 years now gave them to Radnor, the Frigons, the Pellerins, the Gelinas, forge names that turn up in the parish registers of St. Maurice village across generations. William Henry Drummond, the poet brother, came to Radnor for the fishing. There was a small lake nearby, Lac Wayagamack, that the family had quietly acquired. He'd take a boat out at dawn and write letters back to Montreal about the trout and the loons and the sound of the blast furnace carrying across the water in the still summer evenings. He died too young in 1907, just before his brother George Edward's biggest move. That move came in 1908. In the spring of that year, McDougall and the Drummonds combined Canada Iron Furnace with Canadian Iron Foundry, the McDougall family's parallel company, which had absorbed the St. Thomas Car Wheel Company 5 years earlier, and incorporated a new entity called Canada Iron Corporation Limited. It pulled together, in the biographer's words, 5 mines, 5 coke blast furnaces, and numerous foundries located in 7 towns and in 2 provinces. 3 of its 9 directors were American. 2 were from Ontario. 4 sat in Montreal boardrooms. The Montreal Trust Company, of which George Edward was a director, provided much of the financing in the kind of cross-holding web that defined Edwardian Canadian capital. It was the biggest iron consolidation in Canadian history to that date, and 5 years later, it would be bankrupt. Chapter 3. The mark goes national. The CIF mark was older than the company that became its most famous bearer. 13 years before the 1908 merger, in the spring of 1895, the Canada Iron Furnace Company had taken out an advertisement in Hardware Merchandising magazine. The advertisement listed its operations, Radnor Forges, Trois-Rivières, Lac à la Tortue, Grand Piles, and it stamped its product with 3 letters separated by hyphens, CIF. Beneath the letters, in smaller type, Trois-Rivières. The signature at the bottom, Geo. E. Drummond, Managing Director and Treasurer. The mark was already, in 1895, the identifying brand of the Drummond Iron Empire. It would survive every corporate restructuring that followed for the next century. But the corporation that took it national did not survive long. In 1910, the Radnor furnace was extinguished. Charcoal iron, the slow, expensive, high-quality process that had been the Drummond family's foundation, could no longer compete with coke furnace production at scale. The Mauricie men went home, or moved south, or took jobs at the new pulp mills going up along the St. Maurice River. In 1913, the Canada Iron Corporation itself collapsed. George Edward Drummond's own biographer wrote it plainly. The corporation had to liquidate its property in 1913 in order to pay off its creditors, the principal one being the Montreal Trust Company, of which Drummond was a director. The empire he had built came down on his head, and into the hands of the very Montreal financial institution where he sat on the board. He was 56. He had a stroke a few years later. He died in 1924, but the iron didn't stop. The downstream operations of the broken corporation, the pipe foundries, the car wheel works, the casting plants, were reorganized under a new name, Canada Iron Foundries Limited, headquartered in Montreal. Lower profile, more cautious. Built around the surviving plants at Trois-Rivières and St. Thomas, with the CIF mark intact and the order book carried forward. And then, in the summer of 1914, the war that had not been coming arrived, and every foundry in Ontario and Quebec turned its lines toward shell production. The Trois-Rivières plant had its own origin story. The foundry on Boulevard du Saint-Maurice had been pouring iron since 1889, when a small Quebec firm called the Compagnie Canadienne de Conduite d'Eau had built a casting house on land owned by the lawyer-politician Joseph-Édouard Turcotte. That first pour fed a city growing fast. Trois-Rivières was a town of 10,000 in 1901 and would be 42,000 by 1941. The boom rode on 6 industries planted between 1907 and 1922. Wabasso Cotton, the modernized Canada Iron Foundry, Wyagamack Pulp and Paper, Tidewater Shipbuilding, Canadian International Paper. The Shawinigan Water and Power Company's transmission line of 1906 brought electricity into every workshop. And on the 22nd of June, 1908, just as the new corporation was being legally incorporated, a fire broke out in the city's downtown that destroyed 800 buildings before it was done. The 17th century church gone. The central business district gone. The whole downtown rebuilt over the next decade in brick and concrete, by men who walked to work every morning past the new foundry on Boulevard du Saint-Maurice. That foundry, after 1908, was the modernized plant of Canada Iron Foundries Limited. Cupola furnaces consuming coke and limestone, sand molding lines for soil pipe and water main castings, the first centrifugal spinning machines for larger ductile sections, pipes from 3 inches in diameter to 30, lengths of 20 feet, cooling on the racks in long gray rows. The Mauricie families who had worked Radnor moved their sons to Trois-Rivières. The Frigons, the Pellerins. The names continued. Through the First World War, Canada Iron Foundries supplied shell casings, brake shoes, and pipe to the Imperial War effort. Through the 1920s and into the Depression, it built municipal water systems for cities that were still finishing their first reticulation. The Second World War deepened the work. Shell casings again. Naval castings for the new corvettes coming out of the St. Lawrence yards. The Trois-Rivières plant ran 3 shifts through 1942 and 1943 and recruited a younger generation of Mauricie men too young for the front but old enough for the floor. After 1945, the demand turned to peace. Cities needed water mains. Suburbs needed sewer pipe. The post-war housing boom devoured cast iron in quantities the Mauricie foundry had never imagined possible. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the CIF mark went underground in Toronto subdivisions, in Winnipeg suburbs, in the new neighborhoods of East Vancouver. The cast iron century, the century of pipe and pour and heavy infrastructure, had a few more decades to run yet. A foundryman in Hamilton or Welland or St. Thomas could pour iron all his working life and never see his work again. But a Trois-Rivières molder, walking home in the evening along Boulevard du Saint-Maurice, would step over storm drains he had cast himself. The work stayed in the city. The city walked over it. Chapter 4. Goudron and gauntlets. By 1960, the plant on Boulevard du Saint-Maurice was the heart of working-class Trois-Rivières. It sat on the wedge of land between the railway and the river. 2 stories high, clad in corrugated iron, with the cupola stacks rising above the roofline, and a steady plume of gray-yellow smoke that the men in the neighboring streets could read like a weather report. Clear and white meant the furnace was running clean. Dark and rolling meant a fresh charge was going in. The whistle blew at 6 in the morning, at noon for lunch, at 3 for shift change, and at midnight for the night shift relief. The whole district of Saint-Cécile arranged itself around those 4 sounds. Pierre Saint-Yves was born on Rue Saint-Angèle in 1956. His father worked at the Canron Foundry. 40 years later, Saint-Yves gave an interview to Radio Canada in which he described, more vividly than any company history has ever managed, what the work did to a man's clothes. Quand mon père rentrait à la maison le soir, ses vêtements étaient pleins de goudron. When my father came home in the evening, his clothes were full of tar. À la fin de la semaine, on devait les jeter. By the end of the week, we had to throw them out. The tar was real. It was the protective coating applied to cast iron pipe to keep it from rusting underground. The pipe was lifted out of the centrifugal casting machine still hot, dipped in coal tar pitch, and stood up to cool on the rack. The molders and dippers stood close enough to the pitch tank to breathe its sweet, choking fumes for 8 hours at a stretch. The fumes followed them out the gate, into their lunch pails, into the lining of their coats. By Friday night, the household clothes hamper smelled like the inside of the foundry. By Sunday, it smelled like the inside of the church, because the men wore their best to Mass, and the second best had gone in the bin. This was the rhythm of a Canron family in Saint-Cécile. A father walked through the gate at 6 in the morning. He clocked in. He pulled on a thick canvas apron and a pair of leather gauntlets that came up to his elbows. The cupola furnace at the center of the shop was already running. It had been brought up to temperature overnight by the maintenance shift. Coke and limestone went in at the top. Molten iron tapped out at the bottom, 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, into a refractory ladle suspended from an overhead crane. The crane swung the ladle across the shop floor to the sand molding lines, where teams of 3 and 4 men poured the iron into prepared molds at the rate of 100 pipes a shift. The heat was extraordinary. In summer, men closest to the pour stripped to their undershirts in a building where the outside temperature already topped 30 degrees. In winter, and Trois-Rivières. Winters were long, hard, with the river ice cracking outside the foundry walls. The same men stripped to undershirts because the inside temperature was still over 100, and the cold did not penetrate past the first ring of molders. The contrast was so sharp that the old hands developed a system. Layers shed in the doorway. Felt-lined boots for the walk-in, steel-toed for the floor. Nobody taught a new man this. He learned it, or he suffered. Chapter 5. The city that walked over itself. The plant employed several thousand at its peak. A man worked Canron. His son worked Canron. His brother worked Canron. The names that had run through the parish registers at the Forge du Saint-Maurice in 1830 and through Radnor in 1880 ran now through the Canron payroll in 1960. The Frigons, the Pellerins, the Gelina. Yolande Thibault, another voice in the Radio Canada oral history, remembered her father building a family home in Saint-Cécile in 1949 on the strength of a Canron paycheck. It was a 2-story clapboard house with a brick chimney and a porch facing the street. There were dozens like it in Saint-Cécile, all built in the same brief window after the war, all paid for by foundry money, all heated through the long Quebec winters by stoves cast in the foundry that paid for the house that contained them. The product went out into the country. Trois-Rivières' own municipal water system was built largely from CIF pipe. So was a substantial part of Montreal's early 20th century reticulation. So were sections of Toronto, Hamilton, Winnipeg, Ottawa, Vancouver. The fittings went into railway stations, post offices, hospitals. The manhole covers, heavy, ornate, stamped with the three-letter mark and made in Canada, went into city sidewalks from Halifax to Victoria. The Ductile Iron Pipe Research Association would later operate, from 1989 onward, a sesquicentennial club recognizing cast iron mains in active service for 150 years or more. Many CIF mains in major Canadian cities are still well inside their first century. They are working. They are carrying water. They are doing the job they were poured to do. Outside Sainte-Cécile, the CIF empire of the 1950s and 1960s was extensive but easy to overlook. The St. Thomas, Ontario plant, the old Russell car wheel, works inherited in the 1903 merger, was, by the early 1970s, the only manufacturer of railway brake shoes in Canada. The Iron Foundries fed steel scrap into the casting cycle. The Hamilton plant supplied Ontario's water and sewer projects. The corporate office in Montreal moved orders and finished product around the country through the same Canadian Pacific lines that had run past the original Radnor furnace 70 years earlier. The CIF mark, by the post-war decades, was the default specification for municipal cast iron across English Canada and Quebec. City engineers in the 1950s, ordering replacement mains for aging Edwardian-era pipe, ordered the same brand that the original Edwardian-era city engineers had specified. The work was organized. The Métallos, the Quebec wing of the United Steelworkers, the Fédération des Travailleurs et Travailleuses du Québec affiliate, represented the floor through the 1960s and 1970s. Pay was decent by Mauricie standards. The benefits package was union standard. A foundryman with 20 years in could expect a pension that, modest as it sounds now, was enough to keep a paid-off house in Sainte-Cécile through retirement. The same Yolande Thibault, who remembered her father building the family home on Canron wages, also remembered the small ceremonies that marked careers. The gold-plated watch for 30 years, the modest banquet for retirement, the union pins worn on the lapel of a Sunday suit. The community institutions reinforced the foundry. The parish of Sainte-Cécile, the local branches of the Knights of Columbus, the Caisse Populaire Desjardins, the small shopkeepers along the surrounding streets who extended credit to foundry families during slow weeks and were paid back in full on payday. The whole apparatus of working-class Quebec life rested, in this corner of Trois-Rivières, on the CIF payroll. It was not glamorous. It was not the white-collar Montreal of the Quiet Revolution. The Quiet Revolution touched Sainte-Cécile slowly and unevenly, the way it touched all the industrial neighborhoods of small Quebec cities, more visible in the schools and the hospitals than on the foundry floor. The men still spoke French on the floor, and to each other. The supervisors still tended to be Anglo, the senior management decisively so, with the corporate office in English-speaking Montreal making the calls that landed in Trois-Rivières as memos to be translated and posted. The linguistic geography of Canadian heavy industry was visible in the very architecture of the company. There is a particular kind of pride a foundryman takes in invisible work. The pipe goes into the ground. The cover goes onto the cover. The city closes the trench and pours the asphalt back. The man who made the casting walks past the spot every day on his way to work, and to Mass, and to the Legion Hall, and only he knows what is under his feet. His son knows because his father has told him. The neighbors know because their fathers told them. But the broader country, the country that drinks the water and stands on the covers and uses the sewers, the broader country does not know. The CIF men in Sainte-Cécile knew. They had cast it themselves. Chapter 6. The Diversified Giant. By the early 1980s, the company that had been Canada Iron Foundries since 1908 was something larger and stranger than the foundry men of Sainte-Cécile would have recognized. It had renamed itself Canron Limited in 1970. The new name was a calculated retreat from the foundry past, Canada plus iron, but compressed, modernized, suggestive of post-war conglomerate ambition. It listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Its head office had moved to Toronto, though its operational center of gravity remained in Quebec and Ontario. And its controlling shareholder, holding 79% of the equity, was a Montreal steel and wire holding company called Iveco Inc., controlled by the Ivernier family. Canron in 1981 was no longer a foundry, it was a portfolio. The ductile iron pipe operation at Trois-Rivières and at the Stanton plant in Hamilton was still pouring. Still profitable, still selling into the same municipal market that had bought CIF castings for 100 years. But Canron now also extruded plastic pipe at a Rexdale, Ontario plant it had bought from Johns Manville. It fabricated structural steel at a Vancouver yard on False Creek that had built sections of the Alex Fraser Bridge and the Dome of Canada Harbour Place. It manufactured steel joists at a Calgary works. It built railway maintenance equipment under the Tamper brand at a U.S. subsidiary in Columbia, South Carolina, with international affiliates in Australia, the United Kingdom, and India. It galvanized steel at a Vancouver plant. And at its original Boulevard de Saint-Maurice site in Trois-Rivières, it ran a mechanical workshop that built pulp and paper mill equipment for the Quebec mills upstream. On the 8th of June, 1981, a United Press International dispatch crossed the wires from Toronto. Canron's Rexdale Structural Division had been awarded 2 contracts worth $6.8 million for about 3,000 tons of structural steelwork at Ontario Hydro's new generating station at Atikokan. 3,000 tons. $6.8 million. Bread and butter work for a company of Canron's scale, and one that, read in the cold light of what was about to happen, represents the high water mark. The board met in Toronto. The strategic decisions were taken in Montreal. The Ivernier family, Paul Ivernier and Sidney Ivernier, as the senior figures of Iveco through the period, had bought into Canron not for its sentimental Mauricie roots, but for its cash flow. And cash flow, in 1981, was good. Then it turned. The 1981 to 1982 recession crushed municipal infrastructure budgets across the country. The board began looking, division by division, for what could be sold, consolidated, or shut. The first to feel it would be the foundry that had started everything, the Trois-Rivières plant on Boulevard du Saint-Maurice, the heart of Sainte-Cécile, the building whose 3-letter mark sat under the feet of every Canadian who had ever crossed a city street. The men inside the foundry did not yet know. Chapter 7. Seeds of Decline. The future of cast iron pipe had already been settled before Canron noticed. It had been settled in a German chemical works in the 1930s, where a process was developed for extruding rigid polyvinyl chloride into tubes. It had been settled, more locally, in 1951, when a small Ontario manufacturer called Scepter began making rigid PVC conduit and molding PVC fittings at a Toronto plant. PVC pipe was lighter than cast iron. It was cheaper to make. It was easier to cut, glue, and install. It did not rust. A 2-man crew could lay 100 meters of PVC drain pipe in the time a 4-man crew needed to swing 100 meters of cast iron into a trench. And by the late 1970s, PVC had moved from residential drain waste vent applications, bathrooms, kitchens, basements, out into the street, into the municipal storm drain market, and was beginning to nudge at the water mains themselves. Canron's answer was to buy in. The Iveco board approved the acquisition of Grandview Industries and the Canadian assets of Johns Manville Pipe. The Rexdale plastic pipe plant came online. The plant extruded PVC at margins thinner than the cast iron it was replacing, in a low-skill operation that bore no resemblance to the foundry work of Trois-Rivières. The men in Sainte-Cécile understood vaguely that something in the company was changing. Their own order book was steady. The new Rexdale plant was somebody else's problem. But the cannibalization had begun. Every meter of PVC that Canron extruded in Rexdale was a meter of cast iron that no longer needed to be poured anywhere. The second seed was the recession. It arrived in 1981. Interest rates climbed past 20%. Municipal infrastructure budgets across Canada were slashed. The cities that had specified CIF pipe by default since 1908 began deferring projects, repairing, rather than replacing, stretching the existing network. The Atikokan contract that had crossed the wires in June 1981 was the last great signal of strength. After it, the order book softened. In Hamilton, around the same time, two brothers borrowed money to buy a few dump trucks. Their names were Philip and Alan Fracassi. They started a sand haulage company. Their first regular customer was a foundry at the edge of the city owned by Canron Inc. The foundry sand, used to mold cast iron ingots and pipe sections, was discarded after use, peppered with scrap iron from the casting process. The Fracassis hauled it away. After the workday ended, they would dump the last truckload in their own backyard, pick out the scrap iron, and reload. It was the beginning of a recycling business that would eventually become Philip Environmental Inc., a publicly traded Hamilton waste management company. It was also a sign that Canron sand, the byproduct of pouring cast iron, was now profitable feedstock for somebody else's business. The foundry was leaking value to its own waste stream. The third seed grew across the border. In 1983, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency designated a chemical waste facility in Kent, Washington, called Western Processing, as a Superfund site under federal hazardous waste law. Canron's Vancouver galvanizing operation had been shipping spent pickle liquor, zinc-laden waste from the galvanizing process, to Western Processing through the 1970s and into the early 1980s. The company was named as a potentially responsible party. It paid approximately $3 million to settle the claims. It then litigated the recovery of those costs from its insurance carriers in a case that ran through to the Washington Court of Appeals in 1996. The Trois-Rivières foundry's own contamination, heavy metals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from a century of coal tar coating, the kind of contamination that Pierre Saint-Yves' father had carried home in his clothes every Friday, was sitting on the balance sheet as a future liability under emerging Quebec environmental law. A foundry that had been profitable for 90 years was, by the mid-1980s, a foundry with a thinning margin, a substitute product cannibalizing its own line, and a contamination tail no auditor could ignore. The structural steel side faced its own pressure. Korean steel arrived in North American ports at half the price of Canadian fabricated sections. The Vancouver False Creek Yard's order book, once full of Pacific Bridge and high-rise work, began to thin. The Calgary joist plant held up better, propped by the Alberta construction cycle, but the senior fabricators in Vancouver were now competing against shipments from Busan and Ulsan that arrived in containers and required only assembly on Canadian soil. In Saint-Cécile, the older foundrymen began to notice the changes. The pace of new orders slowed. Younger men were not being hired to replace retirees. The Friday afternoon conversations at the Legion Hall, where the talk had once been hockey and overtime, turned more often to who had taken early retirement and where their sons were finding work now. The Tim Hortons on the corner where the morning shift had filled up at 5:30 was less busy by 1984 than it had been in 1979. The fourth force was political, and it arrived from Ottawa on the 1st of January, 1989. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement came into effect. It did not close any foundries that day. What it did was remove the wall, the tariff wall that had stood since John A. Macdonald's national policy, the same wall that had paid the federal bounty on George Edward Drummond's pig iron in 1900. The wall came down gradually, and gradually, the American iron pipe makers, particularly a Birmingham, Alabama company called McWane Inc., privately held by the McWane family, the largest manufacturer of ductile iron pipe in the United States, looked north and saw a market they had not previously been able to enter. The Iveco board in Montreal saw the same lines on the chart that McWane saw. The decision was already forming. Chapter 8. Fatal Decisions. The first fatal decision was taken in a Toronto boardroom in 1985. Canron had recently acquired Stanton Pipe Limited of Hamilton, a newer, more efficient ductile iron pipe plant on Burlington Street East, close to the Niagara industrial spine, close to the scrap steel supply chain that fed every Ontario foundry. The Stanton plant could spin pipe faster than the Trois-Rivières operation. It was younger. It was nearer the customers. And Iveco, looking at the consolidated balance sheet, asked the board the question that any Toronto-based holding company asks of a Quebec asset. Why are we running two ductile iron pipe operations when one of them is older, smaller, more remote, and sitting on a contaminated parcel? The board's answer was Hamilton. In 1985, Canron consolidated all ductile iron pipe production at the Stanton plant. The Trois-Rivières Foundry, the CIF Foundry, the foundry on Boulevard de Saint-Maurice that had been pouring municipal castings since 1889, was not closed. It was simply removed from the ductile iron pipe order book. The cupola furnaces went cold. The centrifugal casting machines went silent. The pipe-dipping racks went empty. The mechanical workshop on the same site, the division that built pulp and paper mill equipment, kept running. The pipe foundry, the heart of the operation, did not. The decision was rational in narrow terms. Hamilton was newer. The numbers worked. But it severed the company from the city that had made it. The Maurice families who had given 3 and 4 generations to the foundry, the Frigons, the Pellerins, the Gelina, learned that the cast iron pipe their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had been pouring since the McDougall days was now going to be poured by men in Hamilton instead. Many of the Trois-Rivières foundrymen took early retirement. Others were absorbed into the mechanical workshop. Others walked out the gate for the last time and found work, or did not, in a Maurice economy that was already losing pulp mills as fast as it was losing iron. On the 5th of June, 1989, 4 years after the consolidation, a small notice appeared in the Quebec Corporate Registry. A new nonprofit association had been incorporated in Trois-Rivières. Its name was the Association des Retraités Canron de Trois-Rivières. It was a retirees' association. Its formation, in legal terms, marked the moment at which the foundry's workforce had been substantially retired or laid off. Too many former workers, in too short a span, for the parish-level social structures to absorb informally. The Frigons and the Pellerins and the Gelinas, having worked the same foundry for 3 generations, now had an association to mourn it through. The second fatal decision had begun 2 years earlier, in the boardroom of Canron's Tamper Railway Maintenance subsidiary in Columbia, South Carolina. Tamper made automatic railway tamper machines, the heavy track maintenance equipment that lifts, levels, and aligns rail lines under traffic. It was a profitable subsidiary. So was a similar machine made by an Illinois company called Jackson Jordan Inc., whose president was a man named Donahue. The two companies were the dominant suppliers of automatic tampers in the North American market. Their executives had concluded, looking at the same charts the Ivaco board was looking at in Montreal, that the tamper market was shrinking. Railway construction was declining. Capital budgets were being cut. One firm or the other would eventually have to exit the market entirely. On the 29th of December, 1987, Canron and Jackson Jordan signed a joint venture agreement. The two companies' tamper businesses would be combined into a single equally owned entity, with Donahue as chief executive officer. It was a defensive consolidation, the kind of corporate maneuver that, in the language of Ivaco's investor reports, made sense given market conditions. The U.S. Department of Justice sued under Section 7 of the Clayton Act, which prohibits mergers that substantially lessen competition. The case landed in the Western District of Michigan before a federal judge named Richard Enslin. Enslin heard the arguments through 1988. He read Canron's own internal documents. He read Jackson Jordan's projections. And on the 8th of February, 1989, he issued his ruling. He blocked the joint venture. His decision is the single most candid document in the entire Canron corporate record. The market for tampers, Enslin wrote, was shrinking. Prices were stable. Overhead was high. Losses were persistent. One firm or the other might eventually exit the market, but he refused to accept that as anti-competitive justification for the merger. And then, in a sentence quoted from Canron's own legal submissions, the court recorded the company's own admission. Canron may contemplate discontinuing or selling the business if the joint venture is enjoined. It was, in plain English, an exit plan written into a court filing. 3 years later, in 1992, Canron sold Tamper to a Pennsylvania corporation called Harsco Corporation. Harsco folded it into a subsidiary called Fairmont Tamper. The International Directory of Company Histories would later describe Tampa as the company's third most profitable unit in the early 1990s. It went to Pennsylvania anyway. The Columbia, South Carolina, plant kept running. It just no longer reported to Montreal. The third fatal decision was the one the court had effectively forecast. In 1989, the same year Judge Enslin ruled, the Avaco board approved two separate transactions. The first sold Canron's ductile iron pipe assets, the Hamilton plant, the order book, the CIF brand on cast iron pipe, to McWane Inc. of Birmingham, Alabama. McWane created a new Canadian subsidiary to receive the assets, named Canada Pipe Company Limited. The transaction was completed in 1989 without a press conference, without a closing speech, without a final photograph at the foundry gate. McWane's own corporate history would later describe the transaction in two flat sentences. McWane acquired the ductile iron pipe production assets of Canron, which led to the formation of Canada Pipe Company in Hamilton, Ontario in 1989. The second transaction sold the Trois-Rivières mechanical workshop, the surviving division on the Boulevard du Saint-Maurice site, the one that built pulp and paper mill equipment, to a Trois-Rivières-based engineering firm called Le Groupe Laperrière en Véro, controlled by Bernard Laperrière and Laurent Véro. GLV renamed the workshop Fabron. 4 years later, it became GL&V Fabrication. 2 decades later, after a management buyout, it would be renamed FAB3R, the lone industrial survivor on the Boulevard du Saint-Maurice parcel, holding what remained of the Canron intellectual property and trading on the name into the present day. The pipe business went south. The mechanical workshop went into local Quebec hands. The foundry that had been the heart of Saint-Cécile was now a workshop with a different name and a different ownership and, eventually, a different purpose. The decisions that had broken the company across 2 years, Hamilton in 1985, Tampa in 1987 and 1989, the twin sales in 1989, had all been taken in boardrooms. No executive had stood at the gate. No founder figure had given a speech. The men in Saint-Cécile had read about it, after the fact, in Le Nouveau Liste. Chapter 9. The Last Transactions. The dismemberment continued, transaction by transaction, year by year. In 1990, the Vancouver Structural Steel Works on False Creek ceased operations. The yard that had fabricated sections of the Alex Fraser Bridge, the longest cable-stayed bridge in the world when it opened in 1986, and the steel skeleton of the Canada Place sails on the Vancouver waterfront, simply stopped taking new contracts. The men were laid off in stages. The buildings sat empty. In 1992, Canron's plastic pipe division, the Rexdale operation that had been cannibalizing the foundry's market for a decade, was merged with Scepter Manufacturing into a new entity called IPEX. IPEX today is one of the largest thermoplastic pipe makers in North America. The cast iron pipe operation had been sold to Alabama 3 years earlier. The plastic pipe operation now belonged to a merger entity registered in Toronto. The two halves of what had been Canron's pipe business were now in different cities, under different ownership, in different materials. In 1992, Harsco took Tampa. In the same period, the Calgary Joist Fabrication Division was sold to Can-Am Group, a Quebec-based steel construction firm. The Vancouver galvanizing plant was wound down. The St. Thomas, Ontario plant, the original Russell Car Wheel Works inherited in the 1903 merger, the only Canadian manufacturer of railway brake shoes, was closed and demolished. The Hall of Fame inscription at the Casso Station Heritage Organization in St. Thomas records only that Canron closed in the 1980s and the factory was demolished. Each transaction was clean. Each transfer was documented. Each plant went dark with a press release of 2 paragraphs in the business section of the Globe and Mail, or Le Devoir, or the Vancouver Sun. There was no padlocked gate. There was no final shift in the dramatic sense. No last whistle. No last man walking out with his lunch pail. The dismemberment was too gradual for that. Men retired. Other men were laid off. New owners took over. The foundry sand stopped piling up at the Fracassi yard. The cupola stacks at Trois-Rivières stopped smoking. The Hamilton plant ran on under McWane's blue and white signage. The Vancouver Yard's main building stood empty for 8 years before it was demolished in 1998. A single piece of the Vancouver Yard survived the 1998 demolition. It was a fabrication bay known to the men who had worked there as Aisle 6. The Vancouver Heritage Foundation later recorded that 2 steel columns from the Canron building had been reused in the pedestrian bridge crossing the wetland in Hinge Park, near the Cambie Bridge. The columns are unmarked. A small, interpretive plaque nearby is the only physical commemoration of the company's Western operations. In 2003, Ivaco itself, the Ivanier family's holding company, the corporate parent that had directed every Canron decision through the 1980s and 1990s, entered protection under the company's Creditors Arrangement Act. It was acquired by Hyco Holdings and then by Mittal Steel. The Ivanier era ended quietly. In 2006, Aisle 6, the last surviving piece of the Vancouver Canron plant, was dismantled. The steel was shipped to a new structural fabrication facility in Atchison, Alberta, operated by the Supreme Group of Edmonton. Canron Western Constructors, the last operating subsidiary still using the Canron name, had by then been absorbed into Supreme. The bay was rebuilt inside the Atchison plant. The same trusses, the same span. A piece of False Creek, recycled into the Alberta oil and gas fabrication industry. The Trois-Rivières foundry on Boulevard du Saint-Maurice, the building, the parcel, the original CIF site, was not demolished. The mechanical workshop continued to operate, first as Fabron, then as GL&V Fabrication, then, after 2013, as FAB3R. Roughly 50 to 200 workers, depending on the year. Pulp and paper mill equipment. The Canron intellectual property held in Quebec hands. The CIF brand still printed on some of the company's marketing material. The foundry itself, the pipe casting operation, the cupola furnaces, the centrifugal spinning machines, the dipping racks, was simply allowed to fall silent. The exact dates are not in the public record. No closure announcement appeared in Le Nouvelliste that has been retrieved. The end of cast iron pipe production at Trois-Rivières happened sometime between 1985 and 1989, in stages, without ceremony. A century of pouring, and then no pouring, and then, eventually, no men. Chapter 10. What remains? The Trois-Rivières plant on Boulevard du Saint-Maurice is still there. Walk east from the city center along the boulevard, past the railway tracks toward the Pont du Plessis. The wedge of land where the St. Maurice River meets the St. Lawrence is occupied by the same parcel that received the first pour in 1889. The buildings have been modified. Some have been demolished. New cladding has been added. The cupola stacks are gone. But the operating company on the site is called FAB3R, a French acronym whose third element nods to Trois-Rivières. And FAB3R holds the Canron intellectual property and still trades, in part, on the name. Its current chief executive officer, Yves Lacroix, gives interviews to Le Nouvelliste celebrating the company's 117 years of expertise, a phrasing that links the workshop back through GL&V Fabrication and Fabron and Canron to the modernized 1908 reconstruction of the foundry. The lineage is preserved. The pouring is not. The Association des Retraités, Canron de Trois-Rivières, incorporated on the 5th of June 1989, continues to exist. Its membership has dwindled with the decades. The Frigons, the Pellerins, the Gelinas, the Maurice family names that ran through the parish registers of Saint Maurice Village from 1830 onward. The last of them are now in their 80s. In Hamilton, on Burlington Street East, the former Stanton plant operates today as Canada Pipe Company Limited, a wholly owned subsidiary of McWane Inc. of Birmingham, Alabama. It manufactures ductile iron water pipe in sizes from 3 inches to 36 inches in diameter. It is the largest continuing Canadian descendant of the Canron pipe business. The CIF mark has been retired. The pipe leaves the plant under the McWane brand now. In St. Thomas, the original 1873 Russell car wheel works. The plant Canada Iron Foundry, acquired in 1903, the plant that built railway brake shoes through 3 wars, is gone. A 2012 inscription at the Casso Station Heritage Organization records its passage. In Vancouver, The False Creek site is now Olympic Village, where the structural steel yard fabricated the components of the Alex Fraser Bridge in the early 1980s. Condominiums now face the seawall. Two steel columns from the old Canron building, set into a pedestrian footbridge in Hinge Park near the Cambie Bridge, are the only physical commemoration. Most of the residents of the new neighborhood walk past them without knowing what they are. In Atchison, Alberta, Aisle 6 stands inside a Supreme Group structural steel shop, fabricating modules for the oil and gas industry. The trusses are the same ones a Vancouver foundryman walked under in 1985. The work is different. In Montreal, the Ivaco corporate headquarters is gone. The Ivanier family's iron and steel empire was absorbed into Mittal in the 2003 CCAA process, and then into the global ArcelorMittal group. There is no plaque. And underneath all of it, under the Trois-Rivières streets, under the Hamilton sidewalks, under the Toronto storm drains and the Winnipeg water mains and the Montreal manholes, the cast iron poured by Canada Iron Foundries between 1908 and 1989, and by its Canada Iron Furnace predecessor between 1883 and 1908, continues to do its work. The Ductile Iron Pipe Research Association has, since 1989, operated a sesquicentennial club for cast iron mains in active service for 150 years or more. Most CIF mains have not yet entered that club. They are still well within their first century. A water utility manager in California told the association that ductile iron pipe gives 100 to 125 years of value. Many Canadian mains poured in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s have decades left in them. The infrastructure outlasts the company. The infrastructure outlasts the men. The closing image of the story is not a ruin. It is a manhole cover on a Trois-Rivières sidewalk in winter, dusted with snow, with the river ice visible behind it. The cover is cast iron. It is heavy enough that two men cannot lift it without a bar. It is stamped with 3 letters separated by hyphens, CIF. Beneath the letters, in smaller type, Made in Canada. It sits where the foundry that made it placed it, perhaps 60 years ago, perhaps 80. The river is the same river that powered the original Forges du Saint-Maurice in 1730 and the original Radnor charcoal furnace in 1854. The cover is doing the same job a Canadian manhole cover has been doing since George Edward Drummond cast his first pig iron in the Morrissey. The man who poured it is gone. The foreman who supervised the pour is gone. The shipping clerk who routed it to the city is gone. The boardroom that authorized the casting is gone. The company is gone. The cover is still there. Not through one failure. Not through a single padlocked gate. Through a long series of clean transactions, taken in boardrooms hundreds of miles from any foundry floor, until the men were retired, the plants were sold, the brand was archived, and only the iron under the streets remained to remember.